There is a machine shed outside Nickerson, Kansas, where the paint has gone the color of old nickel. Not rust, not chalk, just the particular gray silver that a Gleaner combine turns after 60 summers of wheat dust and winter frost. Reed County records show a combine bearing that same silver left a small contracted factory in nearby Independence, Missouri, decades ago, and machines like it are still parked in sheds across the wheat belt, still occasionally started, still occasionally run. The town where it began is 35 miles from a plant that didn't exist yet when three brothers first decided the color didn't need to be red or orange or green. It needed to be silver, because silver was the color of galvanized steel, and galvanized steel doesn't need to be painted at all. The company that made that decision is still making combines today. Almost nobody outside of a farm remembers its name the way they remember Farmall or John Deere. That is the strange part of this story. Gleaner did not fail. Gleaner won, and then it disappeared into someone else's paint scheme anyway. Gleaner silver was never loud. It was never meant to be. While international harvester farmers bragged about Farmall red and Oliver men swore by Meadow green, the Gleaner farmers' pride was quieter. The machine simply worked, and the unpainted galvanized steel underneath meant it would keep working and keep looking decent long after a painted rival had rusted through at the seams. An orange farm told the neighbors what tractor sat in the yard. A silver combine in the field told them something different, that the man running it had chosen substance over showmanship. That distinction mattered more to Gleaner people than almost anything else, and it is the thread that runs through this entire story. In 1923, three brothers named Curtis, Edwin, and Ernest Baldwin were running a custom harvesting crew out of Nickerson, Kansas, cutting wheat for other men's farms the way custom cutters had done for a generation, with pull-type combines dragged behind a tractor, machinery that was heavy, awkward, and never quite matched to the land it worked. The Baldwins had grown up on a farm near that same town, and they had already spent over a decade tinkering with harvesting designs before 1923, including a failed standing grain harvester Curtis built as far back as 1911. Most inventors would have quit after that kind of failure. Curtis didn't. What the Baldwin brothers built in 1923 was not simply another combine. It was a harvesting and threshing unit mounted directly onto a Fordson Model F tractor chassis, the world's first true self-propelled combine harvester. No more dragging a separate machine behind a tractor. The harvester and the power source became one unit, moving through the field together. And a farmer who had spent his whole life watching combines get pulled through wheat now watched one drive itself. They named it Gleaner, after the old practice of gathering the grain left behind by a first pass through a field. A name meant to promise that nothing would be wasted, that the machine would take every bushel a farmer was owed. Before any of that, though, there was the failure nobody puts in the brochure. Back in 1911, Curtis Baldwin had tried to build a standing grain harvester of his own design, an ambitious machine meant to solve a problem that had frustrated custom cutters for a generation. It did not work, at least not well enough to sell, and for a lesser man, that might have been the end of it. Instead, Curtis kept the idea filed away for over a decade, kept farming, kept cutting other men's wheat with his brothers, and kept watching every combine that rattled past for what it did wrong. That patience is easy to skip over in a story built around triumphant firsts, but it is the reason the 1923 machine worked as well as it did. It wasn't a lucky guess. It was a decade of frustration finally paying off. The company had no factory of its own at first. In 1925, the Baldwins contracted with the Butler Manufacturing Company of Kansas City to build 100 machines. At the Wichita Farm Show that February, farmers put down cash deposits so fast the order was doubled to 200, and every single one sold before harvest. By August of that year, the Baldwins had enough capital to buy their own plant in Independence, Missouri, and Curtis, who had briefly stepped away from the business, came back to design a 10-foot pull-type machine known as the Baldwin Gleaner. Between the self-propelled Gleaner and the pull-type Baldwin Gleaner, the company built 1,550 machines by 1927 and sold more than $1.2 million worth of harvesters that year. It looked, for a moment, like nothing could slow them down. Then, in 1928, Henry Ford stopped building the Fordson tractor in the United States. The chassis the original self-propelled Gleaner depended on simply vanished from the market, and the mounted machine died with it. Gleaner survived by falling back on the pull-type line, which is its own kind of lesson. The company that pioneered self-propulsion spent much of the following 2 decades pulled behind someone else's tractor, waiting for the industry to catch back up to the idea it had already proven. What came next was not the death of Gleaner. It was the decade every combine maker in the wheat belt would eventually have to reckon with. The decade Gleaner decided to bet everything on being self-propelled again, permanently this time. The 1930s brought the Depression, and Gleaner Baldwin combines of independence fell into bankruptcy as sales collapsed along with everything else in American agriculture. What happened after is the part collectors talk about with real reverence. A receiver named William James Brace, working alongside his son-in-law, George Ruland, took the wreckage of the company and rebuilt it. During the Second World War, the plant shifted to producing war-related machinery parts, the way so many farm equipment factories did, and it came out the other side of the war with the capital and the manufacturing discipline to do what it had wanted to do since 1928, build a proper, modern, self-propelled combine of its own, no borrowed Fordson chassis required. That machine arrived, and through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the Gleaner lineup built a reputation among wheat and soybean farmers as something close to the Cadillac of the harvest, a phrase people who ran them actually used at the time. The company's combines introduced a series of firsts that mattered enormously to the men running them for 10 and 12 hours a day. An auger system that replaced the old canvas draper belts prone to tearing and slipping. A rasp bar threshing cylinder in place of the older spike tooth design, which meant cleaner grain and less cracked kernels going into the bin, and a down front cylinder placement that moved the threshing action closer to where the crop actually entered the machine, cutting down on grain loss across the header. Farmers who ran these machines during the 50s and 60s described them in agricultural oral histories and farm show recollections with a particular kind of specificity. Not just that the combine worked, but that it worked in the field the way a good tool feels in a hand that already knows how to use it. A cutting crew running a Gleaner through Kansas wheat in July could point to the down front cylinder placement and tell you exactly why their grain loss numbers looked better than the neighbor's rig running an older spike tooth design. That is the kind of testimony this genre depends on. Not marketing language, but the plain, specific praise of a man who ran the machine himself, season after season, and noticed the difference in his own bin. Alice Chalmers purchased Gleaner outright in 1955, and this is the point where most tractor documentaries would tell you the story ends, swallowed by a bigger brand, the smaller name erased. That is not what happened here. Alice Chalmers kept building Gleaner combines under the Gleaner name at the Independence, Missouri plant, and the silver kept rolling out of that factory for decades. A Gleaner combine from this era, the C and E series machines of the 1950s and 60s that farmers still restore today, represented everything the brand had been building toward since 1923. Full self-propulsion, a cab positioned for visibility across the header rather than off to one side, and a reputation for durability that meant a well-kept Gleaner from this period could still be doing useful harvest work 40 years later. The innovations didn't stop with Alice Chalmers in charge. In 1972, Gleaner became the first combine manufacturer in the industry to introduce electro-hydraulic controls in the cab, a shift toward precision hydraulic adjustment of the header and threshing components that competitors would not catch up to for nearly 20 years. In 1979, the company introduced another major advance in header and threshing design that cemented its reputation among serious grain farmers as an engineering leader rather than a follower. For a brand that most people outside agriculture have never heard of, Gleaner spent 5 decades quietly setting the pace for an entire industry. There is a detail in the AGCO corporate record that most people assume means the Gleaner story ended with Alice Chalmers. The truth is almost the opposite of what most people believe. Alice Chalmers itself did not survive the 1980s. Between 1981 and 1986, American agriculture went through a farm crisis that gutted equipment manufacturers across the entire Corn Belt and Wheat Belt alike. Commodity prices collapsed, interest rates that had climbed above 20% left farmers unable to service the debt they'd taken on during the expansion years of the 1970s, and land values that had been used as loan collateral fell by half in some states within a few seasons. Equipment dealers watched order books that had been full in 1979 sit completely empty by 1983. Allis-Chalmers, the parent company that had owned Gleaner for 3 decades, could not survive that collapse. The company that had once painted its own tractors Persian orange across 1,000 Midwestern farms began selling off divisions, and eventually its agricultural equipment operations altogether. Picture what that meant on the ground, not just in a corporate ledger. A dealer in central Kansas who had sold Gleaner combines every spring for 20 straight years suddenly had a lot full of unsold inventory and a bank calling about the floor plan loan on every one of them. A farmer who had planned to trade in his aging combine for a newer model instead patched the old one together for one more harvest, then another, because the debt he already carried on land and seed and fertilizer left no room for a new machine, no matter how much he wanted one. Across the wheat belt, that same math played out on tens of thousands of farms at once, and it is why so many equipment brands that had survived the Depression, 2 world wars, and every ordinary recession before it did not survive the 1980s. Gleaner passed into the hands of Deutz Allis in the mid-1980s as Allis-Chalmers' farm equipment business was restructured and partially sold. Then, in 1990 and 1991, the pieces of that old empire were reorganized again, this time into a new corporation whose very name was built as a memorial to what it had absorbed. The company was called AgeCo, Allis Gleaner Corporation. The brand that most casual observers assumed disappeared during the farm crisis was instead important enough that the new parent company put its name directly into its own. This is the part of the story that runs against everything the standard fallen brand documentary expects. Gleaner did not go quiet in a scrapyard. It kept building combines under new ownership, straight through the crisis that killed so many of its contemporaries. What did happen, slowly, over the following decade, was something subtler and in some ways sadder. The plant that had built Gleaner combines since 1925 in Independence, Missouri, was no longer where the brand's story was centered. AGCO consolidated manufacturing, and in 2000, the company announced that Gleaner combine production would leave Independence entirely and move to a new facility in Heston, Kansas, 35 miles from Nickerson, the small town where Curtis, Edwin, and Ernest Baldwin had first mounted a threshing unit onto a Fordson chassis 77 years earlier. The manufacturing had traveled the full circle of its own history and landed almost exactly where it started. The final production run at the Independence plant did not end the way most factory closures do in these stories, with an auctioneer selling off machinery to a silent room. What happened at Independence was closer to a homecoming than a funeral, and that is precisely what makes it so easy to overlook. Independence, Missouri is not a ghost town. It is, and has been for a long time, better known as the boyhood home of President Harry Truman than as a combine manufacturing center. And that is itself part of why the Gleaner story gets so little attention compared to the collapse of a Charles City or a West Allis. There was no single dramatic closure day, no last whistle blown over an empty parking lot broadcast on the local news. The plant simply wound down its Gleaner production through 2000 and 2001 as operations shifted to Heston, and Independence moved on as a diversified Kansas City suburb rather than a single industry town whose identity lived and died with one factory gate. Heston, Kansas, by contrast, became something the Baldwin brothers likely never imagined when they were dragging pull-type combines behind a tractor in the 1910s, the literal geographic heart of the brand's revival. The Heston facility centralized engineering and production into a single site for the first time in the company's history, 35 miles from where it all began. Company materials released around the brand's 100th anniversary in 2023 made a point of celebrating exactly this. The idea that 100 years after 3 farming brothers from Nickerson built something new, The machines bearing their invention's name were once again being built almost within sight of the fields where the Baldwins had first farmed and custom-cut wheat themselves. There is no population collapse chart to show here, no photograph of a rusted-out factory floor standing empty. That absence is the whole point. Gleaner is one of the very few names in this genre of fallen brand storytelling that never actually fell. It changed hands, it changed cities, it changed hydraulic systems and threshing cylinders a half-dozen times over a century. But the silver combines kept coming off a line somewhere in Kansas or Missouri in every single decade from 1923 to today. And that continuity is rarer in American agricultural manufacturing than almost anything else this channel has ever covered. Somewhere tonight in a machine shed in central Kansas, not far from Nickerson, a Gleaner C or E series combine from the 1950s or 60s is having its threshing cylinder adjusted ahead of a county fair demonstration. Antique tractor and combine shows across the wheat belt regularly feature restored Gleaners running side by side with the Farmalls and Olivers that get all the documentary attention. And the people running them tend to be exactly the kind of quietly proud owner the brand always attracted, less interested in showing off a color than in showing that the machine still does the job it was built for, 60 or 70 years on. The Gleaner name has never needed the same nostalgia campaign some other brands require, because in a real sense, it never needed rescuing. AGCO still sells new Gleaner combines today, built in Heston, and that fact alone sets this story apart from nearly every other one this channel tells. And maybe that is the real lesson underneath all of it. Most of these documentaries are obituaries. A machine, a color, a factory town, all going down together as the small family farm that depended on them went down first. Gleaner's story asks a harder question. What happens to a legend when it survives, but survives quietly, absorbed into names and ownership structures too complicated for casual memory to hold on to? The Baldwin brothers set out in 1923 to build a machine that left nothing behind in the field. A century later, the company is still standing, still building combines a few miles from where they started. And yet it has become, in the popular memory of American farming, almost exactly what it promised never to leave behind: gleanings, the leftover story, gathered up by the few who still know to look for it. If you or your father ever ran a silver combine through a Kansas wheat field, you already know this story better than most documentaries will ever tell it. The next brand this channel covers did not get to write its own ending the way Gleaner did, and that story is one you will want to hear.